So welcome to a trench chat. We haven't had one of these in quite a while, and I'm really, really pleased this week to be joined by Philipp Cross, who has written down, just looking down at it now, written this absolutely fantastic book called The Other Trench. Now, we often speak on the Old Frontline podcast about the importance of understanding the Great War from both sides, and that's exactly what this book is all about because it gives us, for those who are non-German speakers, a rare glimpse into the German experience of the Great War. So thanks for joining us, Phil, and also thanks for producing this incredible book about your great grandfather's experiences, I believe.
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's my great great grandfather.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, as you can hear, I'm obviously a north from the north of England, which catches a lot of people by surprise because they expect a German fella to sit here. But well, the reason I'm here is because I'm half German. My mother's German, and my dad's an English soldier, so was born on over there in Germany and came over here when I was just 1 year old. So Alexander Pfeifer, great great grandfather, was on my mother's father's side, and yeah, I mean he came from, as you would have read, quite an affluent family. His family owned like a textile company within the textile industry, and yeah, I mean they had this big house, like almost like a manor, called that's Pfeiffer House, big garden. Um, they went on trips away. They had quite a bit of money, and because of this background, he was destined to become like the kind of the boss of this textile company. And during this time as well, he was part of the Saxon Battalion, so like an elite kind of group of the German Imperial Army at the time. And by the time the First World War broke out, he was already an experienced sergeant. And before the war started, he told his wife of his plan to document his time in the war via a diary and regularly send the notes home for her to stash away. And when he returned, he'd obviously kind of make something out of it. And he would take photos as well during his time on the front. But obviously, as you would have read as well, he never anticipated the war to last so long, maybe a few months, as they were told, it'd be finished before Christmas, which obviously never happened. And after fighting, obviously in France, the Eastern Front, the Carpathians, Italy on the Western Front, he eventually kind of gathered all his notes, his photos, everything together and typed it out by a typewriter. And it's practically just been kind of passed down ever since. And over 100 years later, I kind of decided to make something out of it.
And I saw in the book that, I mean, you mentioned these typed notes. It's this kind of really carefully typed manuscript and bound up in a kind of little ledger kind of thing. And although you're clearly for a lad from Manchester, but you've got your roots in Germany, and you
Mhm.
kind of grew up in that culture. I mean, I was reading in the book that your mum spoke German to you at home, and you watched
Yes,
German
yes.
TV and stuff. So you had
Yeah.
that benefit of understanding the documents that eventually kind of inherited to produce this
Oh,
book.
yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's my strong German kind of background. I'd spent summers over there, still speak to my mother in German, with my grandparents would come over to visit, and it was you always felt you had like a sense of belonging, obviously here in the UK and in Germany when I go over there. And all this stuff that was passed down from that side of the family, so the Pfeiffers, it was always around us. So we always had photos, the diary, all this stuff around. We always knew about it. But because it was just so normal to have, no one really did anything with it. It was almost like you lived within this museum and had all these museum pieces to hand and around you, but it just seemed so normal. But then obviously when friends or people come by and you show them the Gurkha knife or something else that he found on the battlefield, you realize how special it actually is to have all this. But yeah, obviously the links to kind of Britain, me being from here and my dad being English, um, you have linked the side as well, the English side, and then all these postcards that were found on fallen British soldiers. You have quite a connection to that as well.
Because I felt the book had lots of kind of different layers to it, and he had a very long war, didn't he? Because
Oh yes,
it begins literally in August 1914, when
yeah.
when I'm presuming he's a reservist because he was born in the
Mhm.
1880s, I think. Is that right?
1880, so he's getting on a bit. He's 34, so he's already quite an experienced kind of reservist, so to say. So literally, it was like 3 days in to the very end of the war he served. So um, yeah, he's quite lucky to have survived it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's incredible,
Mm.
really. And he goes off with his Jaeger regiment to the front. And the interesting thing, I know, when I was reading it, he ends up pretty much on the British sector almost straight away, doesn't he? Facing British troops in that kind of what we call the forgotten front, that bit between Flanders and the rest of northern France, where the ground was flat and static for a long time. But there was some quite big actions there in 1914-15, of which he was
Mm.
very much involved in.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, especially like Battle of La Bassée, kind of it was just like they were chasing, they were making a desperate attempt to be the first to get to Calais into the sea, so it was literally just back and forth, fighting almost to the like very end. I mean, there wasn't really much left of his battalion at the end, apart from him and maybe a small fraction of whatever else was left. So, yeah, and obviously during Christmas as well, you hear of things like the Christmas truce and so on. But when I first read the diary, I was expecting something similar, but no, I mean they were literally just blasting each other out with hand grenades, and it was during this time when he found a lot of these English and Gurkha letters as well. So yeah, I mean it was just fascinating because he documented everything so well as well. Wrote on the postcards, the photos, so you knew exactly when and where these things were found.
And that fighting takes him through those early encounters
Mm,
around, as you say, the Battle of La Bassée. Then he's up around Neuve Chapelle in the fighting there in March 1915, up against men from the Indian Corps quite a lot from the descriptions that he gives, which is a really interesting kind of element to it. And then he takes part in the fight in the Battle of Loos in September
mm,
1915. So
mm,
it's kind of that classic first year of trench warfare, and it ties us in. I mean, he was at the Hohenzollern Redoubt, wasn't he? In the
mm.
in the ground there,
Yes.
in some of the most famous parts of that battlefield. So it
Mm.
really ties us to those early offensives in that way.
Yeah, of course. And you can really, I mean, the way he writes it, which, as well as you read it, it you sense how the trench, how they gradually evolved, like how they eventually started trenching themselves. At first, it was like just foxholes, and then they started to connect them back towards each other. So I always used to think, how did they dig dig these trenches? How did they get to that stage? But then, because he was literally in the thick of it from the very start to the end, you kind of see how it all evolves and how towards the end of the war, how they just had all this exceptional weaponry, the helmets, the brand new uniforms to match kind of the new or to counter the new threats, the gas during Loos. And I actually went there as well to Loos battlefields, and you're standing there in the middle of where it all happened, and you just look on the ground, and you just see all the shrapnel, the you know bullets, things that would have been kind of utilized and were products from the fighting that took place there. So and that's what really brought it to life to me anyway, and with the postcards as well, and actually taking some of the artifacts from these fallen soldiers and bringing them back to where they were found in the first place. Yeah, it's just really, really fascinating.
I mean, I noticed that he's very honest in the accounts, and it's quite brutal, the depiction of it, because I mean, it
Mm,
was brutal. He talks about that. There's the photograph, in fact, of the body of that dead officer on the
mm,
parapet of a trench, and he talks about them at one stage when they'd overrun some British positions, and it's cold, and they haven't got enough cold weather gear, that they kind of take everything that they can from the packs
Mm,
and presumably the bodies of British soldiers, which was common on both sides of the battlefield in any war. But I think it gives us an insight into just how tough a war this was for these men, because I guess he thought he was going to fight a mobile war in big open fields, and they'd all be
yeah.
home for Weihnachten and back to the Heimat, and that would be the kind of end of it. But it wasn't that at all.
No. Oh no. I think yeah, and I think they realized that soon enough, didn't they? When he was on the train at the very start, documented day by day. And then even after a few days when they got to the train station, they were like dead and wounded, or mostly wounded in the in the waiting area, and they were being seen to by nurses and others. And then they started to realize that, this isn't all that great. But before then, they were, you know, kind of almost like happy to be going to the front, people waving them on, singing songs. And then, a few weeks later, most of the battalion, was more or less eliminated, wasn't it? Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just sections as well where you might remember the part where he is looking at a fallen English soldier and he's reading his letter saying how his wife, the letter was sent to his wife, what was from his wife, and he thought this was the most miserable place he'd ever been to since he landed, and he wished the war was over soon. But then, as Alexander said, well, the war is certainly over for the writer of this letter because he's, there with a shattered skull in the trench. And well, it was to his wife, wasn't it? And Alexander being a husband himself, it must really hit home thinking, well, this could be me. And the fact that he could speak English fluently as well,
Mm.
and understood exactly what the soldiers were writing and saying, it must have really hit home. And it's worth mentioning as well that he was a censor because he spoke English. So we'd regularly go through all these letters to pick out any useful information, and he did this with the French and English soldiers. So, he must, I think, I mean, he doesn't write about this, but how he must have felt reading all these letters. A lot of the letters wouldn't have been of much use to the military, wouldn't have revealed any information, but it would have been personal stuff, especially one addressed to Percy, picture of his family or friends, and then just with love from us all to Percy. And then obviously he didn't make it back home.
No, I mean, I think that kind of the humanity that he had comes across very strongly in the way that he
Mm,
talks about the things that he saw, and then on a battlefield as a soldier, you do pick up souvenirs. I mean, I've got things in my collection, some stuff that veterans gave me that they took from Germans on the battlefield,
mm,
or from the bodies of dead German soldiers on the battlefield. That kind of thing happened regularly. And here we're getting an insight into that from the German perspective, because he did find things, didn't he, that have connected you now to actual
yeah.
soldiers and their fate. And Percy is one of them.
Yeah, yeah, and the fact that he lived just down the road as well from me, up here in Lancashire. I mean, it was just, I mean, the whole journey of creating this book. It wasn't just doing the translation, that was it. It was finding out the individual stories of all these soldiers, and then discovering that they lived just down the road from where I live, where I was raised here in England, and with the story of Percy Walsh. When I did kind of background research, obviously it was easy to find who the soldier was because of how well documented the battle was on both sides. And Alexander drew maps. He wrote on the postcard when it was found and when. So I traced his living kind of descendants to here in Lancashire, and I gave it back to them. So I actually
Oh,
met
wow.
them and spoke to them, and and when the BBC did a report on Percy Walsh and the fact that I gave this postcard back to the living descendants, the story it opened up a whole new can of worms because it turns out that Percy Walsh, the soldier's son, um, he was also called Percy, but we
Hmm.
thought he passed away as a young man. we didn't have enough. I didn't have enough information to hand via Ancestry, and it was because the living relatives of Percy Walsh's son, they're still alive, and they recognised the soldier. And it turns out the granddaughter of Percy Walsh lives literally 5 minute walk, 5, 10 minute walk from my house.
Gosh.
Um, 90 years old. It was just incredible. So I actually spoke to her, and these two sides of the family, of the Walsh family, never knew anything about each other because Alice, the wife of Percy Walsh, she was obviously cut off from the Walsh family because she was widowed. So it opened up this whole new kind of worms and almost brought these, like, kind of connected these two families back together again. It's just incredible how many kind of different stories evolved from this diary and all these items. It's
Yeah,
just, yeah.
I kind of feel sometimes these stories and these the way we connect to these men, we don't always find it, they kind of find us. And I think this sounds to me, it's incredibly moving kind of idea of you meeting the descendants of a soldier who your great grandfather picked up a postcard of him on a battlefield. And then you, all those years, more than a century later, you meet them and they live just
Mm.
5 minutes from your house.
Yeah,
It's just incredible. You kind of
yeah,
couldn't make it up, really. It's kind of
I
like a
know.
Hollywood movie.
I know. I mean, me and my mum talk about it all the time. She obviously met my father in English, so you could have come from anywhere
Mm,
in the UK, but no, it was here in the northwest of England, and then obviously all this stuff over 100 years later has come back from Germany to here and almost began where it all started, so to say. And a lot of these letters were written here um, in England. And there's another one as well, Joseph Langford.
mm.
Yeah, same. He was from Oldham, so not too far away from where I was raised. So yeah, it's just all these coincidences as well.
And he had these souvenirs, he's got you've got pictures of cat badges that he picked up, which then connect you to a kind of timeline of where he was,
Mm,
and the cookery, the Gurkha's cookery, which is quite something, which again, is part of that
yeah,
encounter he had with the Indians.
that one.
Oh gosh, yeah,
I
you're
just
holding it
got it
up
out.
now,
Just
yeah.
I thought it'd be interesting. Yeah,
Oh wow, gosh.
yeah. That's yeah, another one. It's just well, because before it was obviously found, he wrote about how the Gurkhas were, slashing the throats of the Germans that they captured or came across, and you just have these artifacts to hand, these items, and just I mean, I do this. I look at it and just think, wow, was this actually used on a German or one of the Gurkhas' enemies? It's just fascinating to think about. But yeah, obviously, there's no way to find the descendants of that soldier. Well, the soldiers who 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 owned that cookery. I tried, but it's just a bit too difficult. They had letters as well
Right.
um, from that soldier. It was a Gurkha sergeant, and there was the cookery knife that came from him, as well as some list of orders and stuff written um, in Gurkha dialect,
Yeah.
Nepalese. So
Nepalese, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it was a bit more harder, bit more difficult to trace.
Yeah, but I mean, I kind of again, that was very interesting to see that document. Yeah, because it's kind of a list of something, isn't it? And then
Mm.
a description of one of the soldiers. Is that right? I think.
Yeah, it was like a poem, and just maybe something about the soldier who died or somebody that um, the soldier knew of something. It was quite hard to decipher apparently, according to the people who translated it in Nepal. But yeah, so the translation of the book is, I'm assuming that's what it says in the letter.
Because I know at the time the Germans were fascinated by Indian and Gurkha troops because they had no kind of common experience of that in their own history. And they took a lot of the Gurkha and Indian prisoners to near Berlin, and the Humboldt University interviewed a lot of
Mm,
them about language and about the whole kind of dialect and kind of songs that they sang and all kinds of things like
mm,
this,
mm,
and even recorded them. Yeah, so it's certainly a really important part, I think, of that German experience of war on the Western Front in that early phase.
mm.
But
Yeah, and they're not really well represented, the Gurkhas, when it comes to the Great War. So from like the Gurkha community, the um when I was doing my research and reaching out to people, they were really pleased that they were almost like they had a voice as well and they were being recognized. So that was a positive that came away from all this as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I live in a town with quite a big Gurkha population. The guys who I use for taxis regularly, they're all ex-Gurkha rifles
Mm,
guys that had served in Iraq and Afghanistan and places like that. I mean, they're immensely proud of their kind of heritage and history. It's and in fact, next time I see, I'm going to tell them about this because I'm sure they'll
yeah.
be interested. That's great. But his experiences didn't just kind of cover the Western Front, did they? Because like a lot of German units, with Germany fighting a war on two fronts, he ended up on the Eastern Front as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. So he was part of the Carpathian Corps. So being a company commander with him one of the Jaeger regiments, they were kind of the go-to elite troops for carrying out this task in the mountains. And it was during this time as well, mid 1916, when they were trained to be stormtroopers, so shock troops. So it's really interesting to kind of know the process of that, and then obviously going to the Eastern Front, to the Carpathian Mountains, which is a front of the war that's not really um, touched on at all, very rarely. But you really get an in-depth view what it was like. He took the photos along the journey. Um, and then there were times when he fought off about 3,000 Russians with just 250 of his men within his company. Again, it's just something that unless he unless he spoke of it or wrote about it, it would have just been forgotten. Um, but yeah, it's just incredible. And then there's all the stuff, photos from prisoners as well, and they're coming up to the trenches, which was just fascinating. So it was almost like a Christmas truce, but during Easter time on the Eastern Front, and up until now, it's not really been talked about at all.
No, I think that I mean that is something I'm afraid I'm guilty of with this podcast. We haven't done
Mm,
enough on the Eastern Front, and it's a kind of very different war to the war on the Western Front in that there were periods of kind of peak activity of which he was involved in. I see from the book, but long periods of static, even longer than the Western Front, long periods of static warfare where there was nothing much going on, but yet I mean people were still being
mm,
killed, but it was a front where you could go to towns and villages and take photographs and
mm.
kind of look around as well as be a soldier on the front line.
Of course, yeah. And I mean, you see so many different communities as well within these pictures. I mean, you had the Jewish communities, the Ruthenians, groups of people I didn't even know existed, if I'm being honest, but they were just so at the time, which I go on about in the book. They were like from a different world, like from a fantasy world, the way they dressed. They were almost like 1,000 years behind. And the reasons why I explain in the book. And yeah, and then it's almost like a sightseeing, and then a week later they chasing the Russians back out of a trench down a mountain, and he's experiencing one of the worst weeks of his life again. So it's just so you realize as well how random conflict is from
Mm.
Alexander's perspective. Because one day it's almost like he's on holiday or on leave, and then a few days later he's in the thick of it all again.
And incredibly, you know, he continues to survive. I mean, you know, many of the veterans that I spoke to could never understand how they survived and others didn't. And I guess with him, you know, by the time he got to 1917, he's been on the front line for 3 years. He served in two major theatres of war, and then he goes off to another one. He goes off to Italy to
Italy.
fight the Italians on that
Yeah,
front line.
he just does it all, doesn't he? I mean, even when I got to that, um, when I first read it, I was just like, wow, this bloke's just done everything. And he wasn't just, some regular soldier. He was actually one of the company commanders who one of the first company commanders to storm the Tagliamento bridgehead, and they rushed. the Italians so tremendously. They were literally in the middle of them. So there were Italians on one side ahead of them, and then thousands of Italians coming from behind because they were just retreating en masse. And then there was another scenario where the Italians rearmed themselves, and then they started shooting at Alexander and his company, threw themselves down, and then they were just in the middle of a big firefight. But the detail he goes into, how he describes it, I find anyway, it's almost like a novel in some in some areas, and then it just kind of leads into the next day. And it's just fascinating how he actually maintained the diary for so long and how we actually could be bothered to do that after such a long day. Whereas if you have a long day at work, you just want to relax, watch TV, don't you? But he's there after nearly being killed about 5 times, writing a massive report about it.
Do you think it was one of the ways he was able to keep sane, maybe, in the midst of all that?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's clear that he was a good, he could articulate himself very well through his writings, and it was probably just a way to process it, I suppose. In this day and age, we suppose we have therapy and talk to people more open about things, whereas back then it wasn't probably seen as a manly thing to do, especially as an officer, as a company commander. So it was probably just his way to relive it and go through things again. So yeah, maybe that was just his way to his form of therapy, I suppose, taking the pictures. After the war, writing the diary, or sorry, typing out the diary, he collected newspaper articles, a lot of stuff he actually glued onto probably the equivalent of cardboard, like cereal boxes, list of names of men that he fought alongside and who unfortunately died, and then he'd write in pencil who these soldiers were. Or
Mhm.
I mean, it's all in my cupboard next to me. I mean, heaps of it, articles, journals. So it must have bothered him very much. But based on his life yet after the war, the photos that we've included in the book as well, he there were there weren't many signs of him having any sort of PTSD, but based on what he went through, some of the stuff he describes, it's hard to believe that that wasn't really the case. But maybe, like you said, the writing, kind of writing all the photographs, documenting it all, that was his way to kind of cope.
Because it must have been difficult for German veterans when they came back to make sense of it. Because if you'd fought in the British or Empire forces, then it's clear cut. You've won a war. You've come home. You're part of the victory. The Germans,
Mm,
they don't have a victory. They've got a defeat, and the nation is in turmoil for the next 2 decades, really.
mm, mm,
And for men like him, who are proud of what they'd done, what they achieved, who they were, and their sense of, I guess, country and service, and not really probably even being able to talk about it in a wider circle, really. It must have been incredibly difficult to cope with
mm.
all that. And maybe
Oh
that's part
yes,
of it.
it was. I suppose it was all like brushing the carpet. I suppose, wasn't it? Brushing the rug. Um, And yeah, I mean, it was for anyone, it would have been hard to overcome. I mean, they were expected to just carry on as if nothing had happened. I mean, he was well, my great grandmother was actually born exactly 9 months after he returned from the war, which is quite funny. And then he just seemed to live a normal life of that of a family man, and he continued to run the family-owned textile business. And but luckily for Alexander and his family, they were quite wealthy. So during the Weimar Republic, they still could go on holidays, enjoy their lives, and so on. But yeah, it must have been much worse than he let on. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Germany struggled for an identity in that period, I guess,
Mm,
with the battle of extreme politics from the left and right. And ordinary men in the middle, I often wonder kind of how they felt about that, because possibly neither of those polar extremes interested them, but they still were proud of themselves and what they'd done and seen and been a part of. But at the same time couldn't be really
mm, mm,
because it had resulted in defeat, and Germany was not the country. I mean, he says that is that kind of massive understatement that he puts in right at the end, where he comes home and he says not to the kind of ending that he'd anticipated when he gone
mm.
to war in August 1914. And
Yeah.
it must have been really hard for these guys to kind of square it, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine this day and age, but you put yourself in, for example, Alexander's shoes. I mean, at this time, 1917, over 3 years of tough combat, seeing your men die. I mean, the amount of men that he witnessed um dying and and so on. I mean, it was in the hundreds. And then there were about 37 at the end as well, which I mentioned, who were mentioned just by Alexander to have died by name and so on. Um, but from his original battalion at the start, there was such a small fraction left. And then to see it all crumble away late 1917, 1918, you notice as well in his writings that the entries get shorter, not as frequent. And there's seems to be a lot of corruption within the ranks, a lot of captains, officers who shouldn't have really been in that position in the first place. And when he comes back to France as well, the land just seems to be drained. It's not as good as I mean, it was a war. It wasn't good at all. But the camaraderie, the food, everything wasn't the same. And you notice it as well, even though he never really talks about his emotions. You can tell in his writings how he would have felt at the time. And then, as you said, coming back from it all, it was just a waste of time in his eyes. And for that, many of the men who fought alongside him, because everyone just died for no reason at all.
And when he returned to France in that final phase, I mean, he mentions the kind of talk about revolution back home, which,
Mm,
must have worried those men on the front line, thinking of families being kind of caught up in events that they couldn't
mm,
control, and then make them perhaps wonder what it was they were now fighting for. But you do sense, like you said, a kind of different experience. He's been in France before, but he comes back to a very different France, and then the war, the kind of embers of the war fade away, and it comes to a conclusion.
yeah, of course. And the fact as well, I mean, Alexander was, well, from his perspective, winning on all fronts. I mean, he came back from the Western Front, won most of the battles, Battle of Loos. You've got the Eastern Front, they knocked the Russians out, they beat the Italians, and then it was just this almost like a sense of triumph for it to all to just crumble before him. Yeah, it's just, and then obviously coming back home to revolution and the turmoil that would continue there. It's quite depressing, really. It's quite a bad time to be alive.
And because another war was only 2 decades away, and then, as I understand it, they ended up in what became East Germany, which again was
Mm.
kind of even more of a reason perhaps not to talk about military
Yeah,
service in a German army when you've got the Soviet Union breathing down your necks.
yeah. So yeah, too. Vida was in East Germany, and unfortunately, the entire family business got seized by the communists. And then the wall went up. I mean, he died in 1966, so we literally experienced it all. Relatively peaceful life until World War One. Obviously, fighting the First World War, Weimar Republic, the Second World War, and then a lot of the extended family members as well, distant cousins and so on, fell in the Second World War, and then it was everything else that followed from the communist takeover, family business being taken. So it was yeah, quite a life that he experienced.
And then your mum kind of emerged from that with the collapse of the Soviet Union and creation of a new Germany. She meets your dad, who's from Britain, and then generation later there's you, and I kind of feel throughout this book that he was keeping it, for himself in some respects, maybe as we've said, to deal with what he was seeing. But I also feel that he had in mind that one day somebody would realize the importance of this and
Mm.
do something with it. And I guess that was you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we never know. We'll never know what his true intentions were, but that side of the family, they were so keen on record keeping. I mean, going back to 17, 1800s, everything was documented. I don't know if that's just the German way or if it was just that side of the family. But yeah, I mean, why else would he be so keen on preserving it and passing it down? The photos, writing on every single photograph, um, to say when it was taken, what's depicted, and so on. And but I don't know. I mean, he seemed like a very articulated, very driven man. I think if he wanted to have it published, he probably would have ensured that that would be achieved. So I don't know. I mean, but who knows? I mean, it's published now, so everyone can enjoy it and learn something from it at least.
And I guess that when you were kind of working on this and compiling it, you learned a lot about him, but did you kind of feel that you also learned a lot about yourself as well? And did you see echoes of you, I guess, in the way he saw the world?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff obviously was passed down from Alexander to my mother's father, because he was partly raised by Alexander. So a lot of the kind of the sayings that he said, things in his writings, a lot of the values, things that were passed down. It was stuff that was passed down to my mother, and then obviously to me, and things that I remember from my mother's father when I was younger. It's you read in the diary and stuff that gets said, and oh wow, that's it's like my mother's father speaking here. So it's quite interesting. So it's just stuff that's been passed down from generation to generation. Um, but yeah, it's there's just so much kind of to learn from the man I found, and obviously everything else that comes along with it. The traveling, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have traveled, met all these people. You learn different perspectives, which Alexander did as well. I mean, he traveled all across Europe, and then with him having found all these kind of items and taking the photos of these people, I obviously then wanted to learn more about these experiences of his, and then that led to kind of this big kind of worms, or the big kind of worms. Yeah, it's quite incredible, and I found that others learnt things as well. Um, People on the English side, for example, they had family members who served or even died during the Battle of Luz or La Bassée. And to them, it was like a bit of closure, I think. When I was reaching out to people on Facebook groups and so on, they'd just reach out to me and say, well, my grandfather was literally directly in front of fighting opposite your ancestor. And then they wrote a diary as well, or
Hmm.
wrote a report after the war or during.
Wow.
And yeah, and it was just really interesting because this a lot of these people spend a lot of their lives going into their ancestors' past, looking at war records and so on. And then when you've got someone from the other side, because there's not much available on the German perspective,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to such personal information, it reveals a lot of truth to them. So yeah, it has. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I published the book, and I learnt a lot on the way.
Well, I'm very glad you did it as well because I mean we don't have enough German accounts that have been translated into English, and it's kind of an element that is missing from most people's common journey to the battlefields is the German side. And one of the things that I liked is that you did a journey, didn't you, across the battlefields to visit some of the places connected with where he was, and you went to see Percy on the La Tourette Memorial, but
Mm,
you also tracked down the graves of many of his mates who died in his battalion, and you've
mm.
listed where they are, kind of in the back. And I certainly will be going to visit some of them in the near future because I think that's
Yes.
really important that we do this with British and Commonwealth cemeteries.
Mm.
But the battle is not just one side; it's men
Of
on both
course.
sides
Yes.
dying, and it's important to honour men of both sides.
Of course. I mean, in this diary, you get to know the personalities of these soldiers who died, and fortunately, with the German cemeteries, they don't get as frequently visited is the Commonwealth war graves, which is a shame. But when I went to these places, it was just nice to put a flower down or a poppy, and to show them some respect. There's no one, assuming not many people, if at all, have actually gone to visit them. But when you've got a name, a story, what this person was like attached to this grave, it I admit when I actually went there, it does kind of make you feel quite emotional in a sense. And if you go to the Belly Berklau German cemetery, they were all next to each other in a row. So all these people that he knew who he mentions to have died, they were all just in one straight line. So you can just pick them off one after the other. Um, but yeah, it's very touching.
I think that's really important because I think how people often connect with the history of the Great War is through the stories of individuals, of which there are tons, because that's a common language for British and Commonwealth soldiers. But to have the same for the German side, I think is kind of opens up a new element of this for people who go to those battlefields too, because I think many want to go to the German cemeteries, but don't really understand what it is they're seeing because they're so different.
Mm. Yes, yeah, of course. But with this book as well, I mean, hopefully, which was the intention from the very start, it gives people a reason to actually go to these graves because they've got a connection to these people, and then maybe they'll kind of visit parts of the Western Front they never would have visited before all this. So, um, yeah, it's really hopefully that it will enable that and kind of just allow people to see another side of things.
Yeah, I think it kind of brings a voice to all those hundreds of thousands, millions of German soldiers on the other side of no man's
Mm,
land, who, for a lot of British English speaking audiences, doesn't always have a voice. I think that's the kind of the beauty of this book, and it is a fantastic book. I mean, it's beautifully produced. The kind of account of his account in it is it's just really gripping. I kind of couldn't
mm.
put the thing down, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah,
And all the supplementary stuff that you've put in there really adds a lot to it. And your personal take on, how your life was woven through all this, I think adds to it as well.
yeah. I mean, what was your favorite part, just out of curiosity?
It's because the battlefields of Luz particularly interests me, and it really interesting to see kind of his account of the Hohenzollern Redoubt fighting, which was absolutely brutal and deadly for both sides, and you really get a sense of that. I mean, you mentioned how Major General Thesiger disappeared into the
Mm,
fighting there in September 1915, a divisional commander, and the favourite brother of the late Queen Mother was killed there, Bose Lyon, and all these kind of people. And I think that part of the book in particular. But I did because I've always been interested in the kind of Indian Corps side of their experience on the Western Front, the bits where he's up against them. And as soon as I saw that at Christmas he wasn't in the Christmas truce, I thought he's got to have been facing the Indians because they weren't that interested in a Christmas truce, and and
no.
and both sides have been having a lot of argy bargy before Christmas, which comes across in this book, and you can see why they weren't perhaps in a mood for any kind of fraternization on either side at that point.
Yeah, not at all. Yeah, I mean, what did you think about the I mean, I'd say they're not very talked about on the topics of the Great War, like the when he was on leave, or we just took pictures of his apartment and then he just talk about where he was staying and the two pilots that were shot down because those were
Yeah.
things behind the lines, behind the German lines, which unless he would have documented it, would have been completely kind of wiped out from history, I suppose.
That was really interesting, actually, yeah, because there's quite a few places where he ends up being billeted, places where I've stayed over the years. Tournai, he was at Tournai for a while, and Annalewin, where Albert Ball, one of the British aces, is buried in a German cemetery there, which kind of connects to that story of him seeing those two guys shot down in
Mm,
1915. So that I found really interesting because, on both sides, the soldier's life wasn't just in the trenches, it was also a big chunk of it when they were out the line. And to read a German soldier's account of where he was and kind of places he stayed, it was really, really interesting. And to see
yeah, yeah.
shots of towns that I know really well, because he's in Combray at one point, and there's a picture of the square looking towards one of the churches. And literally just a few weeks ago, I was drinking a coffee in on the
Yeah.
corner of where that photograph is. It's quite something when you
Yeah,
see that. So that's I think the beauty of books like this is because they give us those kind of bits of the jigsaw that we're never going to find anywhere else.
of course. Yeah. I mean, kind of on that topic, someone emailed me not too long ago and said they brought it with them when they went to the Western Front, and then they went to some of the places where we took the photographs. You're there. He was there with the book,
Wow.
looking at the picture, and then looking at the main square into Lille, into the train station, railway station road. And it's almost like a portent to the past, I find. Even
Mm,
I read it sometimes, every now and then, and just flick through. Think, wow, you've got what he says and the photo, and think, wow, it's just not something you'd expect from something from that time. Because a lot of stuff was written kind of afterwards,
mm.
out of memory, and then the photos as well to supplement it. I'm still kind of amazed by it to this day.
Well, it's a brilliant book, and anyone listening to the podcast, I'm always telling them to spend their hard-earned pennies on books, but this is one that needs to come to the top of your pile because it is such an important book. And we'll put links to it onto the show notes and the podcast website, and also to your website, Phil. And you've got a Facebook page as well, I think, haven't you?
Yeah, the other Trench
Yeah.
book, the website's theothertrench.com. So just type that in onto Google and then it should all come up.
Brilliant. I mean, I wish you really well with this because it is, and I keep saying it, but it is a really important book because we just don't have enough kind of accounts of what happened on the other side of no man's land and how they saw the war. And I think that you've done who he was and what he stood for and he's experienced some real justice in this book, Phil. So, massive congratulations to you and thanks for sharing it with us all through the medium of this book.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks for allowing me to speak about it.
Brilliant.
It's been really good. Thank you.
So thanks for that, Phil. And like I say, we'll put details in the show notes and on the podcast website. And I certainly hope maybe one day meet you over there in
Yeah,
one of the German cemeteries, and
yeah,
we can bring together the spirit of I guess how frontline soldiers felt about themselves. Really, is that I
definitely.
interviewed a couple of German soldiers back in the 80s who'd fought in the Great War. Herbert Salzbach was one of them, and he'd been in the artillery. And I remember seeing him sitting there in the National Army Museum in London with a group of British First World War veterans, and they were talking like they had known each other all their lives. And I think the spirit of that is important to kind of carry on.
Of course, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Phil. Thanks for your time and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
And
having me.
and speak soon. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.